Hi everybody, it's Alan Stewart with your Real Estate 101 tips and tricks for the week of October the 20th, 2014. And today we're going to do a bit of a question and answer session where I'm going to go about trying to answer a number of questions that we've had over the last couple of weeks from realtors around our network. So let's start off with a great question from one of our realtors in West Vancouver. The question, while seeming to be a simple one, turned out to be a bit complicated, and it effectively went like this. Alan, at what point can my seller cancel the insurance on a house? That part's pretty easy. According to paragraph 16 of the contract of purchase and sale, it states that the seller cancels their insurance at 12:01 a.m., so a minute after midnight, on the completion date. At that point, it becomes a responsibility of the buyer to have it insured. Now here's where it gets a bit tricky. If you go back to the information page on the contract of purchase and sale, it states that the buyer, under paragraph 7, it states that the buyer needs to have the property insured on the earlier date of either completion, the date that the funds are transferred to the seller, or the date that the seller vacates the property. Now herein lies the problem. You can't insure something that you don't own. If you could insure houses you don't own, there would be an awful lot more fires taking place in and around our communities. People would simply go take out a policy and light a match and claim the proceeds. So you can't insure something you don't own. I'm going to seek some advice from the BC Real Estate Association, but the important component to know is that 12:01 on the completion date is the date where your sellers can cancel their insurance and the buyer can have it in place. One of our senior realtors in North Vancouver got kind of cheesed off the other day when a seller's agent asked for the subject removals to be made by way of the subject removal form and didn't want to accept the subject removals on a standard addendum. Number of issues here. Number one, a standard and addendum is still an effective way to waive or declare fulfilled your subjects, but the BC Real Estate Association has told us quite clearly that their recommendation is that we no longer remove subjects from a contract, rather that we waive or declare them fulfilled. And they've given us a new form to do that. I would suggest it only makes sense to follow the suggestions of our lawyers at the BC Real Estate Association. There's a few things in this new form, the subject removal form, that make sense. Number one, the hard wording states, with reference to the above, the subject to clauses noted below are waived or declared fulfilled. It also states that time shall remain of the essence. My advice is to always use the new subject removal form, which I find people are not using as a matter of practice. Here's a great question from one of our agents in Gibsons, and it's a great question because it's so practical. Dear Alan, how do I go about releasing a seller from a contract of purchase and sale when my buyer has decided that they will not be removing subjects? So the answer is keep it simple. Don't over-explain the actions of your buyers. It could put them in hot water. So simply provide the seller's agent with an addendum signed by the buyer that states the following. The buyer will not be removing their subjects from the contract of purchase and sale, period. The buyer hereby releases the seller from any further obligations to this contract, period. Then you can go ahead, present that to the seller's agents, and both parties can head off on their merry way to either buying or selling a property. One of our West Vancouver realtors had a question relating to how to deal with a contract that came in and it was absolutely illegible. It was about the fifth iteration of the contract going back and forth, and while the new price and the new dates could easily be read, you couldn't even make out the name of the seller on this new copy of the contract. So what do? Well, you should know that the council and the courts have both held up that illegible contracts are not enforceable. And what's our job? It's to put people into enforceable contracts of purchase and sale. So I'd suggest you go back to the purchaser. Go back to the purchaser's agent. They're the one who has the original contract on web forms. Ask them to make the adjustments that the parties have come to terms on a clean copy of the contract. Have the buyer sign that and send it back to you. Now, an appropriate time to do this would be when you're sending back the fourth iteration of the contract that is starting to get pretty degraded, and suggest to the buyer's agent at that time, look, if you're not going to accept these terms, then we need to see a new contract coming back because this thing's becoming illegible. So you go back to that buyer's agent and have them rectify it before your seller signs it. That's perfect. Everyone's protected. Everyone understands the contract that we're signing, and that contract can hold up on its own. Now, if your sellers want to sign the deal, if they say, listen, I'm going to sign that deal because it's got the price that I want, if that's all that really matters to them and they've sought independent legal advice, there's no harm in going ahead and signing that contract and then including with the contract that you're sending back to the buyer, so a signed contract of this agreement which no one can read anymore, along with another contract that we're going to look for everyone to sign. So you'd have your seller sign it at the time you're sending this contract back to the buyer's agent. On this clean copy of the contract that you're going to prepare as the seller's agent, it's going to reflect exactly the wording that's on the agreed upon contract, the way that you see it. So it would include typographical errors and spelling mistakes, exactly the way it's laid out on the contract that's been agreed upon. It would go back to the buyers, signed by your sellers, but it would include the following wording on the addendum, and I'll include it in the comments in the video below. So it would state, this is a copy of the contract made on, and then the original date of the contract, for clarification purposes only. This is prepared only to provide a legible copy. The parties agree that this is an accurate reflection of the original contract of purchase and sale. One of our Squamish agents called me and asked how they can add a party to a contract of purchase and sale after such time that it had been agreed upon and accepted by everybody. This typically happens when the bank wants to see somebody added onto the contract in order to get pre-approval or approval for the financing. So in this case, it was the wife they wanted to have added on. So it's relatively straightforward. There's two options. One, you go back to the seller's agent and look for some permission. Ask if it's going to be a problem to have her added onto the contract. And once they've come back to you and said, no problem having them added, go ahead and send us an addendum, my sellers will sign it, then you can prepare an addendum with the following. It would say, the buyer and seller hereby add the buyer's wife, Mary Smith, as buyer to this contract of purchase and sale. Mary Smith hereby acknowledges having read and approved the terms of the contract of purchase and sale and agrees to be bound by the agreements and terms contained therein. Period. Then Mary Smith and her husband would both sign that addendum. Then the sellers would both sign it. You could submit it to the bank. You could also add Mary's initials and signatures to the original contract and provide it to the bank, but it would have little effect given that her name wasn't on it. It may be something that the bank looks for, however. Now, in the event that the sellers aren't available or they won't give you this kind of acknowledgement that yes, they're fine with signing that, you may want to include the proposed addendum wording that we've talked about in the past to the contract, to the addendum, that states this is a proposed addendum only and will only take effect once it's been accepted by all parties. If it's not all parties sign off on this, then it has no effect on the original contract of purchase and sale, in order to protect your buyers and make sure we're not opening up the contract. If you need that wording, give me a call. I can get it to you, or just look back on our sales meeting minutes in the past. I get goosebumps, literally goosebumps, when I'm hearing the results that people are having as a result of taking part of what they're learning in the Richard Robbins Master's Edge program that we're running on Fridays in the North Shore and Tuesdays on the Sunshine Coast. Let me give you a little example. So a couple of weeks ago, people's homework was to contact five other realtors within the group. We have about 30 people participating. Just call 5 of them and rehearse this script. And the script was relatively simple. Essentially, you're going to let people know that you're revitalizing your business, you're making some big changes. You want to ask if you can incorporate them in your new newsletter that you're going to be putting out on a regular basis. Number 2, would you consider using me as a realtor of choice in the future? Number 3, if so, would you refer me to your friends and family? So that's the essence of the dialogue. They were supposed to do that with these 5 realtors. So one did, contacted a realtor on the Sunshine Coast with his practice script, wound up receiving a real referral as a result. Another one decided not to contact the realtors, thought he'd just use it in the hockey locker room and try and pick up some business that way. So he went to a relatively influential guy on the team, reminded him that he was in the business, told him he was making some changes in his business, wanted to revitalize it. Would you consider using me the next time you're thinking about buying or selling real estate? Yes, of course, was the response. Then he said, would you mind referring me to a friend or family if you heard they needed real estate help on the North Shore? Absolutely. Guess what happened? An hour and a half later, he receives a text message from the same guy saying, give this fellow a call in Pemberton. He needs some help from a realtor in North Vancouver. Now this realtor has just picked up a $1.3 million buyer for North Vancouver looking for a detached home. Not a bad score from just having one conversation. Then last week, one of our realtors had to excuse herself from our class, and she was really apologetic, came and found me afterwards and said, listen, I hated missing yesterday's class, but I wanted you to know that I had to excuse myself because I picked up a listing appointment as a result of making my 5 phone calls. Why aren't we all doing this? It's a question you have to ask yourself. It's a question I have to ask myself. Why aren't we doing the things we need to do? There is no excuse. There's nothing but noise and distraction in our business. There's only one job, and that is to get out there and prospect for leads that may turn into eventual business. Shocking, revolutionary. Anyway, I'm going to turn the floor over now to Mr. Richard Robbins, who's going to talk to you about motivating buyers to get off the fence.
Harvey One, Richard here. What I want to talk to you about today is how do we get buyers to make decisions quicker? How do we get them to say yes to a house quicker? I think you would all agree it's very difficult sometimes to get buyers and sellers, for that matter, to make decisions. So here's what we got to do. We got to assist them in the process. See, sales to me is helping somebody make a decision that is in their best interest. So our objective is to help people make good decisions. So how do you do that? Let's say you're taking them out, you're going to show them 4 properties. Here's what I want you to do. After every property, what I want you to do is get them to rate that particular property on a scale of 1 to 10. Say, if you had to rate this home, where would you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10? 10's perfect, 1's a disaster. They might say a 6. Great. You write down a 6, and you got to write this down and say, now what would this property take to make it a 10? And they might say, oh, well, we want to have a pool, you want to have a larger backyard, we want to have a larger kitchen, and write all those things down and say, okay, great, thank you very much. This is helping me understand exactly what it is you're looking for. Go to the next property. They look at the property, same exercise, back in the car, you'd say, well, how would you rate this one on a scale of 1 to 10? And they say, well, this one's probably like maybe a 7.5. Great. What would it take to make it a 10? Well, the master bedroom was just way too small and it didn't have an ensuite. But yard was great, kitchen was great. You go, wonderful. You write those things down. You go to the next property. They look at it and say, well, this one here, I think this was about an 8.5. You go an 8.5. Okay, great. Well, what would it take to make it a 10? Well, everything was great about this property, but boy, only if it had a pool. If it had a pool, because then we got to put one in if it doesn't have one. It's a lot of money and everything else. Okay, great. You write that down. You go to the next one. The next one was a 5. And they said, oh, we needed a finished basement. Didn't like the house. Didn't like the color. Great. So now you've looked at 4 homes. And you go back and you say, well, obviously, the first one's no good. The second one's no good. And the fourth one's no good. But here's what's interesting. This one here, you rate as an 8.5. Now, I've been in real estate for 20 years. This could be you talking. I've been in real estate for 20 years. And guess what we have never, ever seen? A 10. That's right. I bought a number of homes myself, and guess what I've never found? A 10. Here's what our goal is when we're looking for homes. We want to find an 8.5 to a 9, and then we need to turn it into a 10. So why don't we go back to the office, and why don't we look at this property, and why don't we decide what we'd have to do exactly to make it a 10, and if that's manageable for you, maybe we can go ahead with an offer. If not, we can continue to look. How does that sound? All you're helping them do now is helping them make a decision. I hope this was helpful, and I'll talk to you real soon.